Okay. All right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peeler Fitness Podcast. Today on the other side of the screen / the mic, I have none other than the Kedric Kwan. The reason why I say the Kedric Kwan is because if you guys are familiar with the little 74-kilogram powerlifter named Taylor Atwood, he is actually the guy that manages all of Taylor Atwood's nutrition and gets him right on the platform on meet day, which is a huge deal for an elite level athlete. Is first off, managing their off-season nutrition. Since Kedric has his PhD, his master's in sports nutrition, and he also is doing his weight cutting, his PhD in New Zealand, I believe the University of Auckland, under the Dr. Eric Helms of 3D Muscle Journey. And he's got a lot of really, really great insights on how to cut for powerlifting, since that is what his PhD is, and how to optimize nutrition for the power athletes and the strength athlete and the physique athlete. And I also believe that you have some background in endurance as well.
Yeah.
So Kedric kind of does it all. And he's super freaking smart. If you guys listen to the Iron Culture podcast before, there's a whole podcast where he kind of talks about weight cutting as well with other PhDs. So I kind of want to just talk a little bit with Kedric about, I guess, how, for my powerlifters who are listening, how do we become the best powerlifter? How do we come in right on game day? How do we cut weight? When should we cut weight? All that good stuff. So Kedric, how are you doing today?
Not bad. Thank you very much. Thank you for the really kind introduction. And yeah, everything you said was true. Although some people might think it's an insult to have been once involved in some form of endurance sport. At least the powerlifters think that's an insult. But other than that, I think everything was really complimentary. And yeah, I'm doing good. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to first go into your data collection from Worlds, because Kedric, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you corrected from 2018 Worlds and 2019 Worlds, so in Calgary and in Sweden. So
Yep.
kind of talking about asking what your powerlifters, like elite powerlifters, like how much did they cut, what strategies did they use, and all that stuff. So I guess I'll kind of let you take the floor to talk a little bit about that.
Yep. So I started my PhD actually in 2019, and 2018, the data collection that was done was actually done prior to the start of my PhD. So I have two data collection that was done in Worlds, which are like, they are surveys. So I basically walk up to people walk up to strangers. At least to them, I'm a stranger. They are probably like, powerlifting celebrities or whatever. I walk up to them, ask them if they can fill up a survey, and then collect their information, put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then run some stats on it. So in 2018 was just a very general, broad sweeping survey. And what we did was we looked at the practices of what elite powerlifters do. The reason why I feel that this paper is actually currently being reviewed, right? So I've submitted it for publication. Is strong is because we are performing it right after competition. So of course I don't approach the lifters while they're competing, or maybe not even directly after. But I do it within the span of maybe plus minus 2-3 days after their competition. Sorry, yeah, maybe 1 to 3 days, right, depending on when I catch them. And I do that because I want to kind of minimize recall bias. So there's always recall bias, or remembering, when you try to remember an event that's too far away or has passed too long ago, you get that recall bias, and that might throw spanner into the mix, and might just give the data set a little bit more noise, right? So the data and all the information might not be as accurate. And because we're dealing with elite level athletes, and we don't really get high amount of participants, right, in general, right? So having the most accurate data would be very important if you want to show some form of statistical significance. I do believe that my data set, right, or at least it's the amount of participants I collected the information from wasn't sufficient, even for the statistical processing, because typically a survey would usually consist of around maybe more than 100, right, 100 participants, or even more than that. But I only had like 65 because that's all the lifters I could get a hand of while I was in Calgary in 2018. So what we have observed is that for elite lifters, right, they cut on average around like 4.6 to like 4. Around 4.6% of body weight. And while every individual lifter, the amount that they cut is quite variable, I would say that there is a difference that we see, although not statistically significant, that the athletes who are more elite, right, more elite measured by Wilks score, right? At that time, we are still using some form of like Wilks formula, right? The Wilks score, which is a score that takes body weight into account and measures strength across different weight classes, right? So for the listeners out there that don't know what Wilks score is, that's what the Wilks score is. So if we take the higher the Wilks score, the more like quote unquote elite the athlete is. The elite level athletes with higher Wilks score, they tend to cut a higher percentage of body weight. Athletes with higher Wilks score obviously also tend to win medals, because the higher your Wilks score is, unless like something happened, like an injury or something, usually you would win. You would lift more compared to the competitor, right, that has a lower Wilks. And what I would say as well is that what we have found, that something that was statistically significant, was that lifters who medal, right, so who won any form of medal, right, whether it's bronze, silver, or gold, right, lifter who won medals, they tend to cut the response is that they cut weight. The probability of lifters that win medal is higher than the probability of the lifters that didn't. So a larger pool of lifters that cut weight actually went on to win medals, whereas the lifters who did not win as many, right? Not saying that is a direct causation. It's more like, yeah, cool, perhaps because they're elite, right, they're at like the pinnacle of their lifting career, and they already maximize their kind of like potential body weight, or like ceiling, right? They would need to actually cut weight to compete, right? That could be one potential explanation on why the data presents itself as such. So in general, that's what they do, right? I do not look into, like, I can't remember on top of my head what the specific practices are, at least the percentage of it, but I think that the most commonly used method would be water loading and water cutting, right? That's something I can remember. And like any form of like diuretics or laxatives or having like fat burner as part of their strategy to lose weight is the lowest form of like method to make weight. So in general, that is what we found. We've also found that experience kind of correlates, had a relationship, right? Experience as in the amount of years someone has been lifting, or has the amount, what we measure, how we measure experience is the amount of meet that was competed during the year, right, with that competition year. So the more meets they compete in, the likelier it is to actually kind of perform better on a weight cut. And I think that is not a surprise if you think of it intuitively. If you have 3 competitions, 3 meets that you competed, in which you perform weight cutting, you have more practice under your belt compared to someone that actually hasn't weight cut before. You did mention that last time you did the weight cut, you kind of like messed yourself up, right? And you hated it, you didn't do as well. So, but now getting that experience under your belt, you would know that this is what I've done wrong. Let's do it better. So that could be a potential factor as well. The learning experience or from the weight cutting experience makes it a little bit easier. Hence, the lifter can execute it a little bit more successfully. So yeah, that's in general the rough overview of what the results I've gotten from the 2018 survey. And yeah, so do you have any like specific questions regarding that?
Yeah, so I guess my whole overall general takeaway there is that elite athletes tend to, if you want to be elite, weight cutting is probably a part of the sport. And that's probably what you said, it has a lot to do with the whole correlation that more muscle mass has to do with, more increased potential for strength.
Yeah. So in the paper, I actually wrote that elite like lifters who powerlift, they tend to train at a higher body weight to kind of maximize their training results, right? So that could potentially be a case. And like for example, if we look at a lot of the yeah, I'm not saying that lifters they need to be absolutely shredded to the bone to actually prove that they cannot carry any more weight, that they have to do a weight cut. I do think that because despite powerlifting being one of the sports that requires minimal, like I wouldn't say minimal, but less actual physical exertion, right? In terms of like how in like I wouldn't say intense. Intense is a bad word to use, but how much physical activity is being done. I mean, you only have like warm ups and like 9 attempts, right?
Right.
Powerlifting is still a performance sport, which means that nutrition still does play a role to an extent. It's not like bodybuilding where it's aesthetic based uh sport where you don't need to take into account performance, which means that if you starve yourself but look shredded, right? You could probably go by fine, even though it might suck quite a bit. But powerlifting, you still have to keep performance into account, which means that whatever you eat would potentially be contributory to your training success, right? So the ability to be in a slight surplus, right? We could probably talk about this about off-season eating, could have some potential benefits for the powerlifter, right? Even though those benefits might not be as great as, for example, like someone like an endurance athlete who needs a huge surplus of energy just due to the nature of their their activity. So yeah, in general, I would say that elite athletes could be pushing the 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 end range of their weight class. And then if they any more, like let's just say if they have to maintain like 3% above their weight class, and if they have to stay at their weight class, like at the weight they compete at, they might not be able to consume enough calories, obviously factoring lifestyle and all of that into account as well, to help them feel good during training. So yes, muscle mass could be one factor, but another factor could also just be like, cool, right? I need to eat more, right, to train, right, train better. I know people who tell me that, oh man, I've like had a really long day, really tired, but like I just smash a bunch of food, right? Like eat so much carbs. I feel so good during training. You know, I've heard that multiple times with the athletes that I've coached. So that is like one potential factor. If you can eat more and still make weight, right? It's probably a good thing to have that uh, buffer uh, in all that tool or in your toolbox, right, where you can just take out and use it whenever. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts for like perhaps the reasons why elite lifters like tend to cut more weight.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good point that you had for most people, because um, something I do talk about quite a bit on my profile is why body composition is kind of underrated for powerlifting. Why I think that more powerlifters probably should take a little bit more attention to that, just in general, because like what you said, that's what you're training with. That's what you're getting mostly your results from. And while you might not need to be absolutely shredded, if you're especially in like a lighter weight class, typically you're going to be a little bit leaner, as opposed to like a higher body fat percentage in one of those higher weight classes. Would you say that, I know that there's a lean tissue component to fat mass? Would you say that it's easier to cut weight if you have more body fat as opposed to muscle mass? How does that play into consideration with weight cutting? Because I know that muscle is mostly water too, but does that play any component in considering how much weight an athlete could cut and get away with?
I think there's a paper that actually, I can't remember who the authors were on top of my head, but there's a paper that actually said in one of their discussions, they mentioned that athletes that have a higher muscle mass actually tend to perform the weight cut itself more successfully. And like you said, that you could potentially attribute it to the amount of water the muscle has, right? So not to mention water, but muscle is also a depository for like carbohydrate, so stored glycogen, and every gram of glycogen, I think you store 3 grams of water. So right, if you people that like deplete their glycogen to a small extent, all right, they also could lose additional weight from that. So I feel like at the end, I think lifters, at least based on the limited evidence that we have right now, lifters who have more muscle potentially could be able to perform weight cuts better in the rapid sense. So when I say rapid, I mean within the week of composition. But yeah, if you have more body fat and you carry more body fat, the gradual dieting process, which is losing weight further out from competition, would definitely be easier because you have more body fat to lose, right? And people who have higher rates of body fat would tend to lose body fat quicker. So yeah, I guess it's kind of like where you're measuring, where when is the time point you're measuring the cut to happen? Are you doing it gradually or doing rapidly? But yeah, I think at least from the limited evidence, people who are more muscular could be more successful with the rapid weight cut.
Okay. So essentially, I guess in terms of acute weight cutting, if you are leaner, then it seems to be a little more successful. Then that's just what the limited data says at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it could be also like there could also be multiple explanation for it, right? Like maybe the more muscular you are, the probability of your training, it is more probable that you've been training longer than someone who's less muscular, right? And maybe during those training years, you've actually built up some form of like resilience towards not re- not resilience, but more like mental resilience towards like all of these stresses from weight cutting, right? Or maybe for as a matter of fact, if you have done powerlifting for a while and this is not your first weight cut, there's also higher probability of that weight cut being successful because you've already experienced it. Where someone who has less less amount of muscle, they might have not the probability of someone who has lower amount of muscle doing the weight cut for their first time might be higher is than the probability of the group that has more muscle mass, which I assume they are more well trained. So the likelihood of them having performed a weight cut before is also higher. So that could be another explanation as well. I can't really the mechanisms of why someone who is like leaner. When I say leaner, I also mean like in general more muscle, not just like skinny, right? Have a higher rate of success is not properly elucidated. So I can't really say why, but yeah, those are like some potential explanations there.
Okay. So I guess a follow-up question to that would be, I guess, who would you consider a good candidate for weight cutting? Who should even consider it? Because I think that lots of times, people probably do it when they shouldn't.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to qualify this is that you do I would say that it's easier to kind of like make a positive claim than a negative claim, right? So like a negative claim is harder because you've got to go like say, oh, quick, there's no such thing as there's no such thing as a, for example, like a rainbow color rock in the world. Like I wouldn't know that for sure unless I went everywhere in the world and actually looked at every single rock and said that there's no such thing as a rainbow colored rock. But if I just said, cool, all right, I've that if I make a positive claim and say like, oh, there's a rock that is shape of my palm, all I have to do is just find a rock that's shape of my palm. Like if I find one, that I can stop my shirt. stop my surge. So like I would, so it's easier for me to just say what if you should cut if you are in this situation, rather than say, oh, you shouldn't cut. But in general, I would say that if you're trying to break a record, right? If you're trying to break a record in a specific weight class, right, you should consider cutting. If you have competed before, so if you are not in your, if this is not your first powerlifting meet, then you can consider cutting, right? And I would say that those are the only two primary factors. If yeah, and I would say if you do not have too much body weight to perform a rapid weight cut, you should consider cutting. And when I say too much, the safe range I would say for most people is roughly 3 to like 4.4%, right? 3 to 4.5%. Some people would push it to a high range of 5%, but I've seen lifters that who actually push it to the edge a little bit more, find there's a higher there's a larger probability of them doing some form of like heat, losing weight through heat, right? Like a sauna or whatever, because they just have so much to lose. So they the lower I would recommend the lower end range. And if you fall out of that range, right, then you should probably move up a weight class.
Yeah. All right. I think that's all really good to just like divulge before we hop into strategies for weight cutting. And you already said water loading is one of the most common ways of I guess rapid weight cutting. And again, Kedric also did point out, there's a difference between like long-term weight loss, which is going to be more so manipulation of actual body tissues. And ideally it's going to be muscle and fat in the off season or further out from competition. And when you're closer to a competition, we're mostly going to be manipulating things like gut contents, substrate utilization or like storage, so like glycogen, and then basically mostly just body water. Since most of our bodies are water, I believe it's like 60%, if I remember my physiology. But anyways, we're bags of water. So I guess, could you talk a little bit about, so now let's say that you fit into one of those categories, you're within like you said 3 to 4.5% of your weight class, you're going for a record. Like for me, I'm going to be going for the IPL World Deadlift record in September. So like something in my situation, it makes sense. So would you, I guess, go into the tiers of, how would you first off go about having a weight cut for an athlete, on how to do it, and like what like the last resort measures would be. And then we can kind of talk about some differences between like 2-hour and 24-hour weigh-ins.
Yep, for sure. I do think that different degrees of there are different degrees to rapid weight cutting, right? For the sake of the discussion, I would not talk about like gradual dieting for now, but I would say the degrees of rapid weight cutting would be segregated by how much weight that athlete has to lose. And when I say weight, I measure it in percentage body weight rather than like absolute weight, because obviously absolute weight would differ from weight classes differ from athletes to athletes based on the different weight class, right? Obviously, if you're 100 kilo, 1% body weight is one kilo, whereas if you compete in the 52 kilo class, that's almost half the amount, right? Despite the percentage being the same, the absolute amount is almost half. So I would say if you have anything more than like, I would say if you have anything less than 1.5% body weight, you could probably, I think the safe range is like 1% or 1 to 1.5%, but you can just really safely perform some kind of like overnight fast, right? And plus manipulating your food volume. And how you do that is by reducing the amount of fiber and that you consume and swapping out your carbohydrate sources for fat sources or food that are more dense in nature. For example, if you eat like 10 grams of fat, you're getting 90 calories because 1 gram of fat has 9 calories. One multiplied by 10, that's 90. But to get 90 calories from carbohydrates, you need around like 4.25 or something like that, right? So it's sorry, not 4.25, double that. So it's like 20 point something, right? Yeah, 20 point something grams to get 90 calories. And so it's almost double the food weight you get to get the same equal amount of calories. And that is because carbohydrate is a less dense food per gram compared to fat, right? And so if you switch it out and you're still getting the same amount of calories, you are still maintaining your relatively high energy intake, but now you can almost reduce your food weight by half, right? So that's one strategy to reduce the amount of food weight that you consume, because when we go to the bathroom, we don't get rid of everything. But if we do it systematically across a couple of days by reducing fiber and reducing food weight, right, we could potentially reduce the amount of food the food weight we store in our body. So that's one method. Obviously, fasting overnight, if you're just relatively light and you're like, cool, I'm like 100 grams, or like really, really like yeah, like almost like maybe less like than maybe you're like less than 0.5%, right, above your weight class. So you can just potentially just fast, like have an extended fast. So stop eating earlier, right, or don't eat the last meal, and then just fast like 16 hours, 14 hours out from weigh in. You should be able to weigh in. So I would consider those methods slightly less invasive, right? I would call, so this like the first degree of weight loss is like a little bit more like easier to execute, right? There's the investment into your I measure like how hard the execution is, one, by the amount of time you have to invest to it, and two, the potential like physiological stress it is to your body. So the second, that's like relatively that's like definitely on the low end. So the next one would probably be anything above like 1.5% to like maybe 3% or higher. You would have to perform like some form of water loading and water cutting, right? So systematically increasing your water intake across time, and then reducing it on the last day prior to weigh-in. So there isn't exactly the fixed amount of a fixed number where what someone should do, but at least one paper that has been published says the method they use is 1 liter per every 10 kilo of body weight, right? So they increased that for 3 days, and then they reduced it to like 0.15 liters per 10 kilo body weight on the last day. And what they have shown as well is that paper, they the lifters who actually perform some form of water loading and water cutting lost around like, if I'm not mistaken, on top of my head, I cannot remember the exact amount. It's like, I think like 0.8 or almost 1% more than the group that just completely cut out water. So that shows that there is a slight advantage of doing water loading, right? The total amount lost was around 3-ish%, I think 3.4 or something, for the group that actually perform a water load and water cut, whereas the group that just cut out water and stuff and did everything the other group did without water loading lost around 2.6% or something like that. I can't remember the exact amount, but the paper is by Real, right? Read Real, right? And colleagues. So
Yeah.
for your listeners who are interested, can go look that up. So I would consider that slightly more I wouldn't say invasive per se, but slightly more difficult. So it's on a higher tier, simply due to the fact that water loading can be quite time consuming, because you have to like drink a lot of water, and it has to span across multiple days, and it also causes someone to go to the bathroom. So there's a change in lifestyle factors, and it is also like it can be psychologically stressful for the lifter if the lifter hasn't performed it before, because they would likely see an increase in their body weight, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, what's happening, right? Why is my body weight going up? My body weight should be going down before competition, but it's going up. And yeah, so those can be certain factors, right? It could potentially affect sleep as well if people do not allocate their water intake appropriately. If they consume a large bulk of their water at the end of the day, right? The likelihood of them going to the bathroom in the middle of the night is high. So that would be the second tier, or like of like rapid weight cutting methods. All right, and the last tier, usually I would use it for emergency circumstances, is some form of sweating through heat exposure. Right, typically for powerlifters, we don't like do glycogen depletion per se, because to deplete glycogen, you actually have to use the muscle, right? So like you have to exercise or like do cardio, right? For example, like in my days when I was doing endurance research, you have to cycle around like 70% VO2 max, 75% VO2 max for 90 minutes to deplete your glycogen by 50%, right? That's a lot of time. And powerlifters, they don't even go on a bike for like more than 5 minutes. So definitely glycogen depletion isn't
Local overreaching right before competition in your legs.
Exactly, right? Doing cardio before competition is probably like defeats the purpose of the taper. And yeah, I think the powerlifters rather like chop off one of their limbs than to weigh less. Reminds me of like one of the Saw movies, where the person had to chop off their limbs to like weigh something so that they can escape. But yeah, they would rather chop off their limbs than actually do cardio for 90 minutes. For your listeners out there that don't know, I was just joking about that. That was not found in any of my scientific research or surveys.
Yeah, I don't think this is not associated with Kedric Kwan or any affiliates.
Yeah, no actual powerlifters were harmed in the course of my research, at least to my knowledge, at least. And so heat exposure is often like used as an emergency, because exposure to heat, at least extended duration, there is physiological effect, such as like when core temperature is too high, because our body is happy at like roughly 37 degrees. That's why when core temperature increases, for example, when someone's having a fever and their body reacts to it by increasing core temperature to like fight off like those like pathogens, it also like denatures proteins, enzymes, and all of that, right? So that's why people like say that, oh cool, your core temperature is too high when you're having a fever, you should probably go see a doctor. And that's also the reason why like heat stroke, right, is, at least this heat stroke scientifically has been given for like 40 degrees Celsius. It's like heat stroke. So there is a limit where our body could actually we can raise our core temperature too. So that is why I would say the physiological effects of using some form of heat to sweat is actually quite high on the tier, because there's a potential physiological impairment when you expose yourself to heat, and that's usually why we use that as an like emergency. But there are also other ways. If you wake up late, not wake up late. If you wake up and then you find yourself like maybe 50 to like 100 grams to even 200 grams above weight, right? And you still have a lot of time before weigh-ins, what you can do is you can like induce spit, right? So like you get a sour candy or hard candy or like gum and like chew and like create spit in your mouth, and you spit in the cup. People might actually think that's really gross, but I think it's like, it looks gross, right? I mean, you get a lot of like spit in the cup, right? Just make sure when you walk, you don't bump into someone and the spit all falls on them. Unless they are your competitors and you're trying to sabotage them, then I'm not recommending that, right? But yeah, but that's a very good way to get rid of like some fluid weight, because like at the end of the day, saliva is like from fluid and water. So as we speak, we are reducing weight as well. So that can be one way to help you get rid of the small amount of weight if you wake up slightly heavier. And that is also like not as not as detrimental as the sauna, because there's no heat exposure. Not to mention, logistically, it could also be easier because everybody can find a cup to spit in, but not everybody can find a sauna. The only downside is that the rate of weight loss from the fluid is actually really low, because spitting often inducing spit happens at a much lower rate than sweating. So yeah, in general, those are the recommendations I would say. And one more thing when it comes to the sauna as well is that I have lifters that I know that they would never make weight without a sauna, right? So it's one of those lifters that's like, I'm gonna do this once more, right? This is my last time doing it. After this, I'm gonna move up a weight class. I wanna finish this with a bang. Like for example, a lifter that got invited to Raw Nationals, right? In the recent Raw Nationals in the lower weight class, because they qualify with their 2019 qualifier, but they were trying to move up a weight class, and then now they're like in the middle where they're like way too heavy to just perform any form of regular method, which the regular methods such as gut volume manipulation, water loading, water cutting. So I know that they would have to sauna on the morning off. What people can do as well, if you have to perform some kind of sauna, is to gradually acclimate to heat exposure. And in the research, what they've done, I think if I'm not mistaken, they did like 12 bouts of like 1 hour spread across the month, right? So 3 hours per week, right? Spread across 3 days, and they repeat it for a month, and that acclimate the athlete, right? I think this is combat sport athletes to heat exposure. And what they found was that the tolerance to heat exposure was much better. And there's also like some of them actually there was also increased sweat rates. So yeah, heat acclimation to heat exposure could potentially be useful if you if you know for sure that you're going to perform a sauna uh, as part of your weight cutting strategy. So I guess I've covered that. Yeah, I've covered quite a bit. Yeah, on top of my head, I think that's all the weight cutting strategy that I've covered. And of course, like there are those like if you have really long hair, you can just cut your hair off, that kind of stuff. Which
Richard Cho.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I guess just kind of to recap, if you have less than 0.5% body weight to lose, so like about a pound, just an overnight fast, cutting out food about 12, 14 hours, maybe 16 hours before competition should be good. If you have 1.5%, then probably do in addition to that fast, manipulate food volumes, like lower fiber, potentially like a liquid diet, so like having ice cream or having like chocolate, basically the opposite of what your mom wants you to eat. You just go into kid mode,
yeah.
and then substitute carbohydrate for fats, since carbohydrates store 3 grams of water, also have more food weight. I do want to ask one thing about that. How long would that take for actual depletion to happen for carbs for fats, of like switching over? Because I understand that like it does make sense in the taper week when training volumes are low anyways to do that, because obviously if you're in training and if you're not having sufficient carbs, there's some arguments for are you going to be able to get enough glycogen resynthesis from hard training, since modest glycogen depletion does impact resistance training to a decent extent. How long would you recommend implementing that protocol for substituting carbs for more fats to actually have a noticeable impact on body weight?
Yeah, I usually do it for 3 days in a row, right? So 3 days prior. I also think that once we are not actually like depleting glycogen per se, right? You do lose some glycogen. Like I've mentioned, you lose really small amount from you lose really small amount of glycogen if you're not actually exercising, right? You lose some overnight from liver glycogen because our body likes like carbs, and there's glycogen stored in our liver around like 100 grams 150 grams, but around like muscle is the biggest depository, right?
Mm-hmm.
For glycogen, right? 300 grams to 400 grams more if you're even if you're well trained, right? But those muscle glycogen, you don't really get depleted much. And I think that the ill effect is not as big as what people think, right? I think that it's more psychological, because if you change your glycogen, your diet from a more carbohydrate based to a more fat based one, that is a big change in your lifestyle, right? You could be freaking out like, oh, what should I eat? I'm not used to this. So I do think that future, like, forward planning would help a lot. If you're a coach, you definitely have to speak to your athlete about it, right? Give your athlete options, right, to pick from, and not just like freak out on the day itself and then like go on a whim and say, I don't know what I'm gonna eat, but I'm just gonna decide on the day that I'm gonna start switching my macronutrients up to a more fat biased macronutrient like configuration, and then they start freaking out the day itself. I do think that mental aspect is a little bit is more detrimental, because, like, I mean, let's face it, research has actually shown like glycogen synthesis happens isn't as important, right, within, if you exceed the 24-hour period. Even for endurance athlete, they say that the rate of glycogen resynthesis only matters if you are training twice a day, or you have 2 events in a single day. Whereas if you actually surpass 24 hours, right, the likelihood of the glycogen being fully resynthesized is it's almost like 100%. So this is also after bouts of glycogen depletion. So can you imagine if you're like a powerlifter and your glycogen isn't really depleted at all? So having it 3 days prior, I don't think is actually detrimental to performance at all, which is why it's kind of like in the second tier of like second tier of the amount, the degree of hardship of weight cutting, and the degree of hardship is also like proportional to what I would recommend. Or based on what you need. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then for water loading and water cutting, how long would you recommend water loading for? And then, because what I've done with my athletes, I'll basically do a period of about 3 days or 2 at the minimum. It depends on how much they have to lose. Generally, like if I want a little bit more of an effect, with altering like antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, stuff like that, I'll have it be for a little bit longer, just so like, insurance policy, I guess. But I've done like a minimum of like 2 days, and I'll go back to normal intake like 1 day, like 2 days before weigh-ins, and then the day before, like cut it to like, half a liter at most or whatever. Say if they have like 1 gallon per day, I'll do 2 gallons for like 2 or 3 days, then normal intake, and then half a gallon or less. Is that kind of about the right way to approach it, or how would you recommend? So I know that they said, for every 10 kilos of body weight, but like, have like a liter, which for me is like 2, that's like an extra 2 gallons.
Yeah, I do think that, like I said, the research out there, the research in water loading is still in its like infancy, so there isn't much data out there. But usually what I do with an athlete, if they first come to me, is I said that, have you done a water load at water cut before? If so, how have you done it? And after they have shared with me how they've done it, I would then look at, and then I ask them, was it successful? If it's successful, we just replicate it, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to look at is, we look at exponential increase of water, right, compared to your regular or habitual water intake. So I think that is the key there. How you achieve that and in what amount, the research doesn't really have a rough doesn't really have anything to say about that at this current time. And whether you look at different water loading strategies, such as step increase. So one day you drink like 5 liters, next day you drink 6 liters, the last day you drink 7 liters, and then you reach the peak of your water consumption on the closest to your meat, versus if you drink like a similar amount across all 3 days. Whether which one is more effective than the other, we do not know at this moment, because there's no research being done on that. I generally would follow what the scientific paper says, because at least I have some assurance that it has been done and before in a controlled setting. But the only thing I would change is just that I would do like 80% of what the athlete should consume on the first day, and I would give them an additional day to start. That just kind of like sensitize them or like ease them in, right? Because for some people, drinking like say 10 grams, sorry, 10 one 10 sorry 1 liter per 10 kilograms of body weight is actually a lot, so I would ease them in with one additional day. So instead of a 3-day period of water loading and water cutting, they now have an additional fourth day at the start, which is 80% the amount of what they should be doing. Yeah,
So would you hold them at that peak water consumption for 2 days then?
I hold them for 3 days.
3 days, okay.
Yeah,
And then do you just pull it out to like half of that the day before?
I usually do like around I just follow the recommendations on the paper, which is like 1.5 0.15 liters. So that's like a big decrease, right? So
Okay.
it's like
Yeah,
that's like that's 85%
yeah.
decrease. But I do think like even like an 80% decrease would be good. I don't think people I've tried being on a little bit more uh con, con conservative side and giving them making the decrease a little bit less sharp, and it seems to work. So like I said, the exact amount isn't really isn't really well elucidated by the scientific research as of now.
Sure, makes sense. And then I guess if you have up to 5% of body weight to lose, all those strategies, and then you best get to sweating and spitting.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the individual response, this is probably why you should probably, before you do an actual water cut, so you're a little bit less stressed out, it might be a good idea to do this in like a deload or during, like a deload period of training or something like that, before competition, if at all possible. Is that a strategy that you like to use with your athletes, just to kind of understand how they respond?
Yeah, I mean, like you could potentially try it out. I do think that for lifters who are quite variable, that I think every lifter is different, So if a lifter is like high on the neuroticism scale or has like high anxieties, having them practice it could be good. Where some of them be like, yep, cool, just tell me what to do, I'll execute it, right, and I'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think some form of practice, having some practice under your belt could be potentially useful. But yeah, I don't necessarily see, I wouldn't say 100% you need to have a test period before you actually do it, perform an actual water cut. I think it's a individual and case by case basis that falls within the purview of the lifter themselves or their coach.
Cool. So it's basically, there's not much individual variation between like how much lifter will lose.
There's no research there yet, but most of the time, like I've never really like factored that into account, because there can be a host of other factors, right, as well, right? To actually say the inter individual variation is caused by like the actual protocol is quite hard when you're not in a controlled setting, right? It could be like I would, for example, I would not know how stressful the athlete is with work, right? If we did it at point A and if we did point B, right? Different stress levels outside of the gym due to lifestyle could potentially affect the amount of water loss as well. So it's kind of hard to quantify the exact amount.
Okay.
But so far I've not, like I said, because when it comes to science, we use we, at least from the research, from the only research that most of the water cutting protocols I use are based on. I mean, like how science work is that, for the listeners out there that doesn't know like how like this like science and stats works, that the more participants you have, right, you kind of like flatten out the individual differences, right? So you can kind of like be assured that even if there is an individual difference, it wouldn't be huge to the point where you like a 1% or 1.5% difference, right? So you could lose 1.5% more or less, right? Because that would definitely affect the standard deviation and the mean.
So
Right?
in other words, like regression to the mean is kind of just like what you use, basically. Like you're going to like expect like the average, and then if somebody's like less, then it's like, okay, like, well, now we know, or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. I also think that the only thing that would potentially affect the someone a lot would be females who are having their menstruation. So there's something to factor into account as well.
Cool. All right. Well, that's all really, 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 really good. So I guess how would this affect a 2 hour weigh-in versus a 24-hour weigh-in? Obviously, you can get away with a little bit more in 24 hours in terms of like weight cutting. I am coached by Eric Bodhorn, of the strength athlete, and he usually says for 2 hour weigh-ins, he doesn't like going above 2% usually. If he can get away with it. He said 3% is like the very, very top end. So like if I was to be like 83 kg competing in the USAPL, he wouldn't want me to be more than 180, 188, 189. For like a 24-hour weigh-in, he said you can get away with more, but he still prefers not doing that. But you get upwards of 5%. What do you say that's about right?
I do think that the big thing when it comes to, I've not coach anyone with a 24-hour weigh-in before, like specifically focus on their cut. I do think that the only difference you have is one, for people, if we look at the research that has been done in weight cutting in general, most of it comes from combat sports, right? Like taekwondo, MMA, judo, boxing, all that kind of stuff. That's where most of the research actually comes from. And what the research has shown is it skews a lot heavily towards performing some form of heat exposure to sweating during for those athletes. And the reason being so is that you can manipulate all your gut volume and all of that, whatever, right? But you're probably still going to lose the same amount of weight. But you have more time to do other things, which means that if you lose X amount of weight, you from sweat, you can recover from it, right? And you can get rid of you can bring your core temperature down, right? Within a 24-hour period. Whereas a 2 hour period, your core temperature might still be elevated. And the thing with a 24-hour weigh-in as well is uh you can, after weigh-in, you can just eat, right? You can rehydrate. And I think that we will probably talk about this like really soon. But I do think that the research has shown for combat athletes, they lose anywhere from like 6 to like 13%, right, of their body weight in a 24-hour weigh-in. I do not recommend that for powerlifters in general. And I won't be able to give recommendations for 24-hour weigh-in athletes, because it is also beyond like my knowledge. I know, like, I've seen like crazy stuff with powerlifters like replenish with IV drips after that, and I find that like absolutely, like, yeah, it's like out of, like, yeah, I cannot comprehend that. So I know, and I'm not even sure, like, I'm not familiar with the rules and rules from federations, that whether like what each federation permit, and like whether they can use IV drips or what the potential rehydration methods. So I don't really have much to comment in that sense. But I would say that, yeah, if you have more, you can lose more weight in a 24-hour weigh-in because you have more time to recover. Current research has shown that combat athletes who has usually have around 24 hours to weigh in actually tend to bias their weight loss, rapid weight cutting method towards some form of sweating through heat exposure.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that clears things up. I guess kind of just going, this is a great way to go into reconstitution. What do you do after the weigh-in? Because something that many people who are familiar with this will kind of understand, it's not necessarily about how much weight that you can lose, because you can lose a lot of weight acutely. It's about how much weight can you put back on to get back up to your normal training weights. A good example of reconstitution being a hindrance to performances. Jonathan Kago, his performance at the 93, he still took away the gold in the 93s, but he said that he was like not up to training weight. He usually trains around 210, and he was at 206. And he said that he was experiencing lots of negative symptoms and cramping and all that stuff. So what would you recommend? What steps should be taken for reconstitution so that you can get your body back up to training weight?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily, like, from what I've seen, I don't necessarily think that having, like, I don't think there's anything special about getting your body, your body weight back to training weight. Like the only thing is that if I get it back to training weight, it is like a guarantee that I've consumed at least enough, right? So, and it's also quite hard to say. Like for me, I don't think that I don't think training weight is a useful marker for people, because it's like, which training weight is your training weight?
Sure.
Like 2 months away, right? Is your training weight 6 months away, right? Is it 1 week away, right? How much of the training weight, how much of your weight loss could actually be tissue, like you lose tissue weight, like it's quite hard to say. And in general, I would say you want to put back the amount of weight you lose um prior to the start of the rapid weight cut, right? So actually, like what I usually say, if you put back the amount of weight loss, let's just say you start at 76 kilos and you have to cut to 74, that's 2 kilos. So you want to put back the amount of weight loss then in the amount of fluids consumed, right? So if we go by the assumption that every gram of water is every mil of water is 1 gram, right? So if you have to put on 2 kilos, you have to consume at least 2 liters of water before you step on the platform. That's my general recommendation for people, because if you look at it, at the end of the day, like substrate depletion in your body, one, doesn't really happen much for powerlifters. Second, substrate utilization isn't really a big factor as well, because like I said, you're only performing 9 lifts. What really matters the most is fluid replenishment, right? That's a big factor, because you lose most of your weight through like fluid manipulation, whether that's from water loading or water cutting, or dehydration from heat exposure. So I think that would be the primary factor people should do. I recommend that for all my athletes, they would consume at least 50% of what, minimum 50% of what they should replenish. So let's just take, if they have to replenish 2 liters, they would drink at least 1 liter within immediately after weigh-in. So they just have to chuck 1 liter down, right? And then after that, they have to wait 20 minutes before they start consuming food, because we want to slow down the absorption of water, right? Like I said, absorption, rehydration, and absorption of water is the primary thing we want to be focusing on. So we want to like wait around 20 minutes before we start actually consuming food. And I think that's also like food slows down the rate of gastric emptying, which means that how quick whatever's in your stomach passes through and get absorbed into your bloodstream through like the intestines and stuff like that. And I think there's also research out there that showed that like the amount of calories actually also, like calorie dense fluids, for example, or fluids that are more calorie dense actually get absorbed slower than fluids that are less calorie dense, which is why in general we don't want too many calories too early. So 20 minutes after consuming that amount, then they can start eating. But I would say that if someone can finish the recommended amount of water, right, in this case is the whole amount is 2 liters, they would finish that as fast as they can. So if they can chuck that straight away, even after they finish their 1 liter, then they would do that as well. But I would say minimum you at least get 50% of that. And yeah, you can have that in the form of like electrolyte solution, electrolyte and solution, or like whatever like you all have that in the States, like Pedialyte, Tri-Oral. It's quite hard to get an exact like ratio down of like potassium to sodium. So but in general, for every the ratio is 3:1. So for every 3 grams of sodium, you want 1 gram of potassium. So that's just a rough ratio if someone wants to actually look into the exact amount they are trying to look at. And yeah, in general, that is how I would recommend. And in terms of eating, I would always say the reason why I don't think it's a good idea for people to like say this is the body weight that I need to get back to, like my training body weight, which is I don't know what the arbitrary amount would be, is because they would just stuff themselves with food. Like I said, substrate utilization is not high. Substrate absorption is even lower, because for most part, like what is limited by carbohydrate absorption, right? Carbohydrate at least is the at least at this sense, the primary source of fuel, is you only get 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour because you're limited by like certain transporters like SLGT1, things like that. So there's no point really eating so much, just stuffing yourself. I would say, yeah, get some food in, get some carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates would work. Personally, the way I do it is I have like white bread and honey because I find that that's like light and easy on my tummy. I just realized I just rhyme in my head, white bread and honey, because it's light and easy on my tummy. So yeah, that's what I.
Your name is Kedric, so Kendrick Lamar maybe.
Yeah. That is actually what yeah, people usually call me Kendrick the first time I introduce myself. But yeah, I guess like you want to eat something that you've had before. You don't want to eat something that's new, because you don't want it to upset your gut, right? You don't want to be running to the toilet too frequently, and that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you don't want to be like destroying the platform with your with your human excretion. But yeah, I do think that in general, if you get the basics down, right, your rate of success is much higher. And then throughout the meet, just continue to keep drinking, staying hydrated, and I would say have food whenever you feel like. If you should eat enough to not hungry, right, and not starving, but you shouldn't also stuff yourself. So yeah, that's the general recommendation I have for all my lifters.
Yeah, what I usually tell my lifters to do is, in terms of like nutrition, is I will say, whatever you eat around your training, whatever food sources that you digest well, I want you to eat that on meet day. And then like what you said, just eat as is. Like for like what I literally do is I bring like rice cakes and like a whole entire like thing of like clementine oranges and like protein powder, because like that just digests super fast for me and feels good, and salt and stuff like that. So I think that's all really good points. I really liked how you also said training weight's a little bit overrated. It basically is more about like, just do you feel good and like doing things properly and drinking and managing all those things. And if something's wrong, what would you kind of do? Like, in the case of like a Keiko, where he's like cramping up all the time, does that just like an improper weight cut, or is that like outside stressors that you just can't really control? Like, in case something goes wrong, like what would you do to help minimize the damage?
Yeah, it is funny because at least from the last time I looked, there isn't really a specific mechanisms of why cramps occur. I think that the general hypothesis of like, like whether you have enough like sodium or potassium is like not really accurate. So they don't really know like, or like if you don't stretch, like you get cramps, like those general traditional hypothesis on what results in cramps has been like disproven. And I think the current like most plausible explanation that's on the table is some form of like due to like nervous system excitement or something like that, which honestly I don't think you can control that. So I think that we can say that we want to minimize those factors that could potentially cause it. Like I said, if you don't get enough electrolytes, right? So how do you do that? You have enough sodium and potassium. If you don't like stretching, whatever, how do you prevent that, right? Make sure you warm up thoroughly before you go on the platform. But other than that, there are only certain things like within your control. And if you cannot control it, I guess I wouldn't say like you're doomed, right? But like I say, I don't actually know the intrinsic details of what happened to Keiko. I didn't listen to the podcast with on the King of the Lifts, but I know that he also had like other factors like lifestyle factors or like travel issues and whatever. So that could potentially be an issue as well. I think that it's quite hard to tease out what the exact issues are but if a cramp happens, you just need to like manage it to the best of your ability, right? I think that for most people who are actually doing some form of weight cut, and the bigger the weight cut is, the more you have to factor this into consideration, is that it probably be a good idea to go conservative on the squat, because the squat is the closest lift to when you actually start your rehydration. So there's a potential that whatever you've consumed isn't being like fully absorbed yet, right? Usually people might be a little bit more, I would say, be a little bit more conservative on the squat. If you don't feel good, right, then you can go harder on your bench press and deadlift. So I think that in general, that's a strategy. There is always going to be unexpected factors, but if you always have to go through a really hard weight cut, and if you have to, and the weight cut is always really hard, and you cramp up every single time, right? And perhaps it's time to move up a weight class, right? I look at people like junior lifters who weigh in, like for example, you have lifters like I can say without I can say without a doubt, like for example, if we use like Michael C, for example, right? He weighed at like 73.98 or something like that, right? And he recently moved up from the juniors, right? Because I think 2019 he competed in the juniors as 74. Like I do think that in the future he's not gonna be at 70. He won't compete in the 74 kilo weight class. Because if you're always like
He did say he was going to move. He did say officially he was going to move up to 83.
Oh, did he?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. So I guess like people like Ricky Cho, all of them, like I guess I called it. I mean, I'm not trying to brag, but like based on this observation, like I called it like those people would never stay in the 83, the 74 kilo weight class for long because one, if you want to progress as a lifter, you have to potentially pack on more mass, right? And if you're already borderline, like at the borderline weight, weighing at the borderline weight after performing a weight cut, right? You and as a junior lifter, which means that you have a lot of training years under your belt. For example, if you use Taylor Atwood, right? I think Taylor is like almost 10 years older than Perkins, or like almost like at least 7-8 years older than Ricky and Michael. So he has more train, and if you assume that if they continue training for all those 7 years, they would definitely pack on some muscle mass, right? So the weight cut will only be much more difficult, right? And I would say that if you're facing all these kind of troubles that you cannot solve, right? Especially if it's something that we don't really know why it's happening, for example, like cramps and stuff. And if you have done everything in your power to actually try and mitigate and prevent cramps from happening, and you're still going through them, perhaps you should try moving out a weight class and try not cutting, right? Or just don't cut for a meet and see if those cramps are missing. Because like I said, cutting is a stressor, right? And the stressor will affect you in different ways that we actually cannot account for, right? We might get all the physiological replenishments that we need, but what about the stuff that we don't see and we don't know that's happening? So those are like my general recommendations per se. And I only use this example. I'm not picking on like Ricky or Michael, but I only use this example because like I did Taylor's nutrition, so I needed to make sure he weighed in. So I looked at what he weighed in at, right, and then I saw the weight of other competitors or what they weigh in at, and those were the only two lifters that I can remember, right? I didn't even watch any of other Raw Nationals that was not in the same session, right? So I only watched like Taylor's session. I didn't watch any of the other sessions because the time difference is just not favorable for people in New Zealand. And I literally just ensured that he weighed in after he got his first squat. I went to bed, so I didn't even watch the whole meet. So yeah,
you did your job. So I
basically,
guess two final questions because we're coming up on the hour. Is I've heard some people who want to cut creatine the week of meet, and my understanding of the research is that is not really going to do anything effective acutely. It takes about a month for creatine supplementation to kind of stop having saturation. Is cutting out creatine of the week of even a good strategy for acute weight cutting, or would you even recommend that?
So let's just say if we grant the premise that cutting out creatine works, right? Let's say whether it's acute or not, let's just grant the premise for the sake of discussion. And I would say that if you cut creatine out and your body weight goes down, there's also a chance that you're not getting the effects of creatine.
Yeah.
Right. Which means you're also cutting out the ergogenic effects of creatine. Right. So whether you do that in the span of a month or whether you do that in the span of a week, right, at the end of the day, you are not going to reap the ergogenic effects of creatine on the platform. Right. So, like I said, grant the premise of how long it takes to actually get rid of the additional weight from creatine, because I don't actually know per se on top of my head. Like you said, it could be you could need a month, but like I said, even if we grant the premise, you are not going to reap the ergogenic effects of creatine. So then at the end of the day, you have to kind of like ask yourself what is more important, right? And if you have to go to the extent of cutting out creatine for your meat, perhaps you should evaluate like other factors first before doing that. So I don't really have a recommendation per se, but in general, I try not to think too much about it, because if you think about the fact I said carbohydrate as your primary fuel source, I mean that because I don't think I'm not using like ATP as fuel, because I use fuel in the sense that you can consume that fuel source and you cannot consume ATP. And oral ATP is not bio available. So for anyone out there that's about to say, oh, you can consume oral ATP, there's ATP supplements, it basically get wrecked in your stomach. So don't bother wasting your money. So you cannot consume ATP as fuel. But at the end of the day, ATP is the currency of energy, and creatine monohydrate, right, basically allows you a quick turnover of ATP replenishment, which is actually what you need in powerlifting, because like it's just like it's just, if we go by the classification in like the physiology textbook, anything like sub like anything 10 seconds or less is like, yeah, cool, predominantly ATP. Right? So I think that having that, the benefits of creatine could be useful. So given the research that is not conclusive out there, I don't think that people should put too much stress into it.
Okay, great. I guess so. Last question is: let's say that you are an athlete and you are, you've made that choice that, hey, you know what, weight cutting, I got to move up a weight class. How would you recommend doing that over time to maximize performance from a long-term perspective and growing into that weight class, so that you can actually become competitive in that weight class? Since people who are familiar with the research will say that, the exact figure being like, you increase muscle cross sectional area, relative strength actually decreases by 62% initially. Over time with training, as you increase like the tension and the muscle with training, then you'll become more trained, I guess, and then, actually if we have that neurological training benefits. Greg Nuckols has a really great article on that, Stronger by Science, for anybody who is interested. But how would you go about helping an athlete move up a weight class in the way that, it maximizes not only performance, but their body composition, without just getting really, really fat and actually having tissue that would probably help maximize their long-term performance?
Yep. Really, really good question. I think that research out there has shown that if you try to put yourself into too much of a caloric surplus, right, you gain the same amount of muscle mass, but almost double the amount of body fat, right? So I think the paper is like by Garth et al. People can look at it, look it up. So I think that the primary thing that's really important to consider is just not the rate of muscle gain per se, because the rate of muscle gain is really slow, right? And it can be a poor proxy for powerlifters, right? Because muscle gain is not the end goal, right, per se, but to be the strongest is the end goal, right? And we know that strength is a product or the end result of or at least it's an accumulated end result of multiple training sessions. So what I usually do is I would put an athlete in a range that within the range of what the scientific literature recommends, which is like 0.5 to 1.5% of body weight per month, right? And I usually use that as a starting point. And then I would kind of evaluate if whether this amount is sufficient for them to feel good during training. Because the worst thing you can do is I'm in a caloric surplus and my training still feels like shit. That is like the worst thing, because you should be performing well in a caloric surplus, right? So I then look at how much of a caloric surplus they need to perform well. And if they can perform well on within that range, that is good. But if they go exceed the range slightly, then I don't think that that's necessarily a downside as well. But I would say that exponentially increasing your calories. Oh, I'm going up a weight class. I'm moving from 83 to 93. I need to get 93 in 1 week. Like that kind. Like I don't think that is a good approach. Like say one like neurological factors would be there, like proprioception, right? How you feel, how your belt feels, right? How your squat feels, right? We know that like people always say like you have the squat belly, like, it gives you a bigger boost, or that kind of how your belt feels, or even how you set up your deadlift, right? People who have big squat bellies aren't really the greatest deadlifters, just simply due to positioning, right? So you trade off one for the other, things like that. A lot of factors does play a role. So I would say gradually moving up would be a good idea, right? Aim to gain 0.5 to 1.5% of your body weight per month, and use that gauge to adjust between the high and low end on how much calories you need to perform well during training. Because if you have a physically demanding job, right? Like if you are like you work in construction and all of that, you probably need more calories. So that range might not you would definitely fall within the higher end of the spectrum rather than the lower end. So yeah, those are my recommendations. That, like take your time, and it is a likelihood there's a likelihood. I also use these things like when people look at Taylor all the time and people like, man, like Taylor weighs in easy and all of that, but I said that there's a likelihood that Taylor is probably like gonna be in the 74 kilo weight class. People's like, oh, Taylor should go up to the 83 kilo weight class and like destroy everyone. But I'm like, there's a likelihood that he's gonna be there, because the research has also shown that the more well trained you are, the slower your rate of muscle gain is, right? Like you gain it really slowly. So if you can move up a weight class, right, and still gain muscle quite rapidly, it probably means that you haven't maximized your training age as well, right? So for someone who actually is limited by the fact that I'm gaining too much weight, even just from training itself, it probably means that they have not maximized their training age, which if you kind of like look back, you can say that, cool, it means that I still have at least X amount of years in the sport before I maximize my training age, Whereas I think that I'm not saying that Taylor is at his like peak, like, but I would say that he probably has like maximized his training age, but there are other factors that could play a role, like lifestyle factors and whatnot as well for someone. But I would say like in terms of training age, if we solely look at the rate of muscle gain, hypothetically, someone who can gain muscle at a faster rate compared to someone who gains at a slower rate, factoring everything else and making them equal, the only is that, yeah, the person that gains at the slower rate is probably like closer to his peak training age. So I would say that if you reverse engineer that, you think about it, it probably tells you that, yeah, if I can gain weight fast through lifting, I probably still have X amount of years before I maximize the training age. So I don't have to like rush, like.
I really, really like that point that you just made about like, hey, look, if you can gain more muscle and you can like really fast, you're probably not your ideal weight class. Once you notice, things are starting to slow down, in the words of Dr. Eric Helms, you kind of just look like you're just eating more pizza and like not really much else is happening when you gain weight. You're probably closer to your ideal weight class. So I really like that. And then focusing on, just slow weight gain over time as more or less a measure of like, growing into that weight class, and then seeing where body composition kind of ends up. And then, you can manipulate it from there as needed to, I guess, optimize how you feel, how you look, how you perform. Because, everybody has different body fat selling ranges where they feel better at, and they perform, recover, all that good stuff. So I think that's all incredible in information. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I think we've covered quite a bit. I hope that your listeners would find this beneficial. So yeah, that's all.
I learned a ton, and I want to just really thank you so much again for donating your time. Being a PhD student is a lot of work, a lot of time. So yeah, I guess to end things out, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm usually most like, I mean, I'm trying to cut down my time on social media, but I guess that's still the best way to reach me. At Kedric TSG, so KEDRIC TSG, or if you want to reach me via email, right, you can go to Kedric at the strength, email me at kedric@thestrengthguys.com. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much again to Kedric for coming on. Make sure to follow him on all of those platforms. Get coaching from him if you are interested in this. He does nutrition coaching, and he also does do powerlifting programming, and also physique, and lots of other things. So he is very well qualified. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.